to Iowa City's Other News. Today is November 22nd, 2003, Saturday. We're talking today about media reform issues, and recently I went to a conference in Madison, Wisconsin. That was November, I think, 7 through 10. It was called the National Conference on Media Reform. And with me today in the studio is Mark Andreevich, who is a University of Iowa Communication Studies professor. He was also at the conference. I'll let him introduce himself and kind of say hi here. So go to that camera, I guess, and show Mark. Thanks for being on the show, Mark.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you were at the conference a couple weeks ago, and give me an idea of some of the sessions you attended and why you went.
I went because I used to work in journalism. Now I study the media. So I have a pretty firm commitment to thinking about reform issues, reforming the media, and I'm very curious to see what's going on in the world of, in the activist world, about what kind of ideas people are coming up with. And I went to some panels on media literacy, concentration of ownership in the media, and I went to saw the whole variety of featured speakers that they had in the evenings, which included legislators, media activists, and academics. I like to see all of them working together. Too often, I think, the university splits off from the activists who are kind of separated from the politicians. What was so nice about that conference was seeing them all kind of working together, kind of theory, practice, and legislation.
One of the keynote speeches, or the featured speeches at night before the concert, I saw Robert McChesney, who's at the University of Illinois, and he was talking about how as soon as they had the the conference kind of set up, I want to say it's Mark Copps.
Oh, Michael Copps.
Michael Copps, the FCC commissioner, said he would come immediately. He just was ready to go to the conference, wherever it was, whenever it was. He said, "Count me in."
Oh, cool.
And that was interesting to see this activist in the university team up with this FCC commissioner.
Yeah, they call him the dissident FCC commissioner.
And the other thing that was interesting to me at that conference was that everyone seemed to be talking about that FCC issue still, that how people called their congresspeople and their senators and said, do not let this pass. This is a bad thing, this concentration of media ownership and the kind of deregulation of the media.
I agree. I had a very similar reaction. To me, just to explain a little bit, the FCC is looking at changing regulations in ways that will facilitate even large media corporations basically to become even larger. And usually kind of arcane FCC regulations don't get very much attention at all. Sweeping changes that the FCC implemented in 1996 got so little media coverage and so little attention. It was very heartening to see the public response to regulatory changes that were kind of much smaller and more specific than some of the 1996 changes, but the public had kind of gotten a heightened awareness. I was amazed at the public response.
Me too. I'm amazed that then our senators actually did something. It was one of the few times that I've called a senator and then seen them go my way, kind of, and
which senator was this?
I called Grassley and Harkin.
Oh, okay.
And they, at least they voted. To kind of
overturn. And the fact that the Senate overturned these regulations, even though the president says that he'll override, he'll override that. It shows that these are issues that are it's media ownership, the kind of concentration of it, the size of these corporations has gotten so large that the public is starting to sit up and take notice. At least I hope that's
Is that the biggest issue, do you think, today, that in media reform and media issues, the concentration of media ownership?
I've got mixed feelings about making that the biggest issue. I think it's a very important issue. It tends to, a little bit too much, I think, to give the impression that if one only broke down the large media commercial corporations into smaller commercial corporations, that would solve the problem, which I don't think is the case. I mean, one of the problems, as was pointed out in some of the sessions at the conference, is commercial media itself and the priorities that commercial media have and the need for an alternative. Not getting rid of commercial media, but an effective, viable alternative to commercially oriented media outlets. To me, that would be, in some ways, almost a more important issue. But I think we can see the concentration of ownership as kind of a gateway issue. Get people interested, get them involved, and then kind of bring in other arguments about decommercializing, or alternatives to commercial media.
Okay. Good point. I think we have some footage from the conference. I interviewed some of the conference goers, and I taped one of the sessions. One of the other things besides the FCC thing that I heard a lot was, I love my Democracy Now! Whether it's on the radio or as we do here at PATV, we play it on the TV version. Over and over I heard this, Democracy Now!, Democracy Now!. I'm so thankful for Democracy Now! And their coverage of the war and bringing on alternative journalists and hearing these alternative voices. So did you hear that? Did you notice that like a lot of Democracy Now! Talk?
I heard a lot about Democracy Now!, and it's something that they do a great show, and it's something that in activist circles, whenever you encounter people who are interested in media reform issues and are critical of mainstream media, Democracy Now! Is kind of one of these touchstone alternatives that they listen to.
Let's play that first clip, if we could. This is from the National Conference on Media Reform, which is held in Madison, Wisconsin. It was organized by a group called Free Press, which was co-founded by Robert McChesney. And there were many different sessions they had on media reform issues, local media, as Mark said, media concentration, media and the unions, et cetera, et cetera. So let's play that. Is that ready in there? Let's play that first clip and a couple different interviews we'll see from the conference. There it is, the National Conference on Media Reform.
My name is Sadia, and I'm actually a grad student at Cornell, but this year I'm writing my dissertation, so I'm at Urbana-Champaign, just sort of hanging out and working there. And I'm here partly because I'm kind of doing this semi-official internship with Free Press, which has been instrumental in organizing this conference. And I've been doing that because the year before this, I was living in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia has this huge activist community, especially around media issues. So I was involved with the Prometheus Radio Project, and so through them, there was, because all the FCC ruling stuff was happening around that time, there was a lot of activity in Philadelphia around media issues. I think this is a really important issue for everyone, because the media controls so much of what people see and what they understand of the world. And it doesn't matter what kind of political work you're engaged in, you have to definitely keep an eye on what the media is saying, but also be able to organize around issues that are important to you, because that stuff is not getting out there in the mainstream media. So I think figuring out how to get the truth to people who are not necessarily particularly actively wanting to seek out alternative news sources is a big challenge. So, like, the challenges of how to get through to people who, basically if they get any news at all, they get it off TV, right? Network news, basically. And they're not the people who are going to choose to go online to check out alternative news sources and to check out indie media sources. So the biggest challenge is how do you get through to them, right? Or because they're the huge silent majority. And they're the ones who will, if anyone votes at all in this country, they're the ones that will go out to vote. So
where do you get your media from? Where do you go?
I refuse to read the New York Times anymore. I just get the headlines through emails just to see what they're reporting on. But in terms of a daily, because I'm from Pakistan, and South Asia has this tradition of newspaper reading, so I have to have my daily newspaper, physically be able to hold it. And so I've been subscribing to the FT, the Financial Times, simply because they're by no means a progressive newspaper, but somehow I find it less sort of bile-producing every morning, because you know what their politics are, and they're just very straightforward about what they're going to cover. But because they're not American, they sometimes have a vaguely critical edge to their reporting about American issues.
It's the London Financial Times,
The
right?
London Financial Times.
Okay.
But also, I mean, online, The Guardian, The Independent, basically, I think the same things that everybody else who's in the progressive left these days is reading, you know, to get any information about what's going on in this country and otherwise. So.
Right, my name's Dahi Wolf. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and I came to the conference to find out ways to get involved with making media more democratic and more truthful. I'm real concerned with the things that are going on right now with the FCC, with the Iraq war coverage. I don't watch any TV news. I do read the New York Times. And I feel like that's one of the reasons I'm here, is having seen incredible changes in that paper just in the last 2 years in terms of self-censorship and shifting to the right, and just being really disappointed with feeling like that, you know, I could trust them to be somewhat mainstream a few years ago, and now I feel like I've totally lost any trust in them being objective in any sense of the word. It's just so many examples of that. I also listen to Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman on the radio, and we're lucky to have a station here that, you know, that broadcasts it. And so I feel like that's given me hope in this movement, and I think that's probably why I'm here at the conference, because having heard about it, you know, through there, and then realizing it was in my own backyard, and then becoming a volunteer, and it feels, you know, I'm just glad I'm here. And,
I'm Steve Kaparian. I'm a union representative with WEAC, which is the Wisconsin Education Association Council, and I'm interested in seeing better coverage by the media on behalf of the issues affecting working families, particularly those around unionization and organizing. I don't think we get a fair and balanced shake from the media, and I'd like to see that changed. I want to be a part of that change, and that's why I'm here.
Okay, we're at Iowa City Other News, November 22nd. You just saw some footage from the National Conference on Media Reform. Those are some conference goers and participants. With me in the studio is Mark Andreevich, and he is a University of Iowa Comm Studies professor. Mark, what did you see in that footage that spoke to you?
What spoke to me most was the dissatisfaction with the media that people are being provided with. To hear people say, I just don't, I don't, you know, the one woman said, I don't read the New York Times,
Right.
the other guy said, I don't watch TV.
Right.
Yeah, there's an increasing, I don't think people are turning away from TV in droves. There are times when I wish they would. But I think people are, in many ways, understanding their own dissatisfaction with what they get from it. And you'd raised this question a little bit earlier when we were talking before the show about why people keep going back to a medium that doesn't satisfy them. And this is an intriguing question, and one that in my classes I've tried to experiment with a little bit. One of the things that I've done is have students who are used to getting their radio news, for example, from a commercial news station that gives them 30-second bites of news and then lots of commercials. And you know, I made them go listen to NPR, and then you know what? Then once I'd kind of immunized them with that, to Democracy Now! And their response was so interesting to me. One of their responses was, you have to really concentrate on these shows because the stories are long and complicated, or for them, they require certain kind of background knowledge and level of concentration that a 30-second soundbite doesn't. And the other thing that was fascinating to me was they said that without the commercial breaks, they didn't get any rest. You know? So what they were expressing to me was a little bit of a sense of it's too much work.
Right.
You know,
Which is why no one's probably watching us. We don't have commercials on public access.
To give you that nice
you
break.
have to sit here for an hour and watch the show.
And yeah, and I got students saying, I started to fall asleep, this type of thing. I think when I sat back and thought about that a little bit, I don't think it's that the public is, kind of congenitally lazy. I mean, I don't think that's what's going on, but I think that if you look at other spheres, the complexity of the knowledge that they have, and they're willing to do the work to uncover it is pretty phenomenal. Look at sports fans. It's very complex, very detailed, objectively to many people very boring, but they're willing to do all the work to accumulate that information. Why not about issues that affect their lives, like politics? Right. One of the things that I think is going on is a commercial model treats viewers very differently than a citizenship model of news would. A commercial model presents news and information as a form of entertainment and cultivates the expectation on the part of the viewers that what they're in for is an entertainment commodity.
A good time.
Yeah, a good or an easy time or something. Just a quick piece of entertainment. Nothing that will be particularly challenging.
Something to relax to, not something that will
turn on,
agitate
put in the
you or,
background while you're doing your homework or doing something else. The other thing it cultivates, I think, as all commodities do, is you don't want to give them. The logic of selling commodities is you give somebody a taste of something that doesn't really satisfy them, so that you can keep repeating that over and over again. And the consumer model is one of repeated consumption of the same thing over and over again. And that's what commercial media give us. I was struck most recently, everybody is now bracing themselves, I think, for the Michael Jackson saturation coverage that we're going to receive in the coming months. And this is
as if we didn't know enough already about Michael Jackson.
And yeah, and
we're going to
as if this is somehow a new and unfamiliar story. I mean, this is kind of the eternal return of the same over and over again. And I know it's going to reach a point very soon where people are kind of making fun about how much Michael Jackson coverage they're receiving. And then the media is going to do something like do a story about how people are sick of all the Michael Jackson coverage. And that will be, just kind of repeating more Michael Jackson coverage. And this is the selling of the same commodity over and over and over again. It's familiar. You turn it on, you know you're going to get Jacko. And I find it particularly disheartening. We're leading up to, I think, one of the most significant presidential elections in recent memory, and people are going to be saturated with Kobe Bryant and Michael Jackson. That's what's going to be dominating Fox News, and the other outlets, because they're starting to mimic Fox because of its economically successful model. A citizenship model for providing media information would be one in which you're not always presented with what you already know, but you're presented with things that you didn't know. You're presented with things that force you to think outside of your kind of repeated self-understanding or repeatedly reaffirmed common understanding of the world. And that's something that commercial news media don't have any particular incentive to provide. So
I always think that for broadcast journalists especially, they go with, or many media makers go with what's easy. It's very cheap and easy to make a reality TV show. You don't have to write a script, you don't have to pay stars. It's very easy to do the same story about Michael Jackson 3 times a day because you do the same story. You don't have to make 3 new stories. You have one that you repeat over and over. I don't know if that's how to break out of that, how to say, please spend more money on your news department and dig and do investigative journalism. That's the challenge.
Yeah, and you're right on. I mean, this is one of the things that media reform people talk about very often, especially in light of the recent FCC debates, is local coverage, local news. And they're worried about once you get these huge media monopolies, that local news is going to somehow suffer. But then you get the companies coming back and saying, look, we own lots of local news stations, and in fact, because of our money, we're able to put in more local news programming. What gets missed in that whole discussion is precisely what you're talking about, is these shows produce local news programming on the cheap in order to get local advertising dollars. That's why they're doing it. If you can, start a new local affiliate, get those local dollars, or not a local affiliate, I'm sorry, a local station that you own, and get those local dollars in. But what you do is you operate with a skeleton news crew, and you go for local news. It's become very familiar. You go for local accident coverage, quick features,
Right.
all of the things that are incredibly cheap to do. You just listen to the scanner, send somebody out, fire, accident, human interest story. That's kind of these formulas.
We're going to play another clip, and when we come back, we're going to talk with a friend of yours who's also a professor of comm studies at Colorado University, Zala Volcic. And one of the things in one of the first interviews we had here was the woman was talking about the London Financial Times and how being outside of the United States gives them a special perspective. So Zala is from Slovenia, is that right?
That's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we'll hear from her after this clip. So let's roll the next segment, the next couple of interviews. This is footage from the National Conference on Media Reform, which took place in Madison, Wisconsin a couple weeks ago.
My name is Craig Simonson. I'm a student here at the UW. I think Madison's pretty blessed. I get my news from a bunch of different sources. We have a weekly newspaper. We have actually several different weekly newspapers.
Can you name them?
Well,
I was going to ask you what.
yeah, the Isthmus. We have the weekly, which is a weekly sort of alternative.
That's the free
news
one.
source. Yeah, that's a free one. Yeah, and these are I guess I'm speaking about like free ones.
Okay.
Because there's the Isthmus every week. I mean, even stuff like the Onion. It's something else. And it definitely is giving another side of the news. Even if it's done in a satiric way, satiric fashion. Things like the Madison Times is a really, really great weekly newspaper, like award-winning. It really covers, the non-white populations of Madison and the area. Things that come out monthly, things like The Insurgents are great. Another great source is I listen to Wart, which is a community radio station here in Madison, every day when I'm at work, and definitely giving me another side of things that I wouldn't find.
Where do they get it? Do they have a wire or something they come up?
Yeah, they give us like the BBC. They have a wire with Pacifica Radio. Programs like Democracy Now, things like that, which I definitely appreciate that. I definitely appreciate that.
My name is Hannah Clark. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm particularly concerned about monopolies on local media. So, for example, there used to be a lot more cities that had multiple newspapers, 2 newspapers in one city, and that's decreased a lot in the last 50 years. And now, with the new FCC rulings, they want, one company to be able to own the newspaper and the television station and the radio station, and I don't think that's acceptable. You have fewer voices, you have fewer people writing the news, you have less competition, you have just less information available out there. And if you just look at what's happened with radio since the Telecommunications Act of 1996, I can hear the decline in diversity in the radio. Musicians who used to get played when I was in high school aren't played on the radio anymore. You don't hear them. You don't hear Ani DeFranco or Tracy Chapman or these musicians who are popular. They're, relatively mainstream musicians, but, they're not as popular as Dave Matthews Band, and they're not having the #1 singles, and they're not on the radio. And they're just not on the radio. And I think that if you if you did a study probably of diversity in terms of what was played on the radio, in terms of the diversity of the musicians, racially, gender, I think it would probably have declined drastically in the last 8 years. What has it been since 1996?
Ms. Rita DeRentz, and I am here from Colorado Springs, Colorado. We have one local newspaper that is extremely conservative. We do have a weekly newspaper that started about 10 years ago that's been quite successful.
It's like a
That's an
free-
alternative free paper.
Okay,
That's
okay.
probably where we get our news.
Yeah. And do you watch local TV news?
Oh, very seldom.
If you can help it.
Very seldom. We only have the networks, and I usually try to get the news from CNN or MSNBC, but even then it's very slanted. So it's a real need. We have that need very much there. So we are, some of us through my Pikes Peak Justice and Peace Commission, which I'm affiliated with, are trying to get a independent radio station going that shows some of the more truth in reporting, which we do not have there. We have, of course, our corporate media and a lot of religious Clear Channel stations, but nothing with alternative news. And it's a very, we need that desperately.
I think that's it. Okay, so we're back at Iowa City Other News. With me in the studio, who has joined us from Colorado, Zala Volcic, Mark Andrejevic from the University of Iowa. Andrejevic, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So we saw three people talking about a little bit about radio. One of the things I want to ask you, though, Mark, is the reason I asked you to be on this show is because I read you were quoted in this magazine called In These Times in an article on The Daily Show and how people get their news from this Comedy Central show. The guy Craig said he likes to turn to The Onion at times just to get an alternative, although satiric, viewpoint. What is valuable about a Comedy Central news show?
I think one of the reasons that I think you find people like Eric, was that his name?
Craig.
Oh, Craig.
First guy, yeah.
Turning to places like The Onion and The Daily Show, I think, is because they're one of the few places where you get a reasonably, well, it's by no means left-wing or anything, but it's critical. You know, it stands up and says, wait, you know, here's what your elected leaders are telling you. You know, just think for a second and realize the ways in which these assertions ring hollow. You know, just step back 1 second and think about it. They have a license to do that because they're not considered to be, you know, objective news outlets, and that gives them a certain amount of freedom. Because of that freedom, I think people are hearing things that they respond to, that they watch the mainstream news and they know, goodness, there's something wrong with this. And the fact that somebody can step back and call it is something that appeals to them, which raises the larger question that you hear put out by liberals from time to time, which is, how come we don't have the equivalent of a Rush Limbaugh or a Mike Gallagher, or these kind of conservative, or O'Reilly? The hope of the left is to be able to have something like that. And I think there are some people who think, maybe Jon Stewart might be starting to push in that direction, or Michael Moore. And, in the end, I'm pretty skeptical of whether that can happen. I have some concerns about it because the strategy on the right is very much of a successful commercial strategy, which is, again, give the people the same stuff over and over again. There's a reason they call Rush fans ditto heads, right? I mean, they're just, they want to have their beliefs reiterated, and then they want to reiterate the expression of their beliefs in this kind of closed circle of not thinking outside your assumptions at all.
Like using Rush Limbaugh's arguments to prove that Rush Limbaugh is correct. Is not a sound foundation of critical thinking.
It's a great consumer model because people like to buy the things that they already know. There's a certain comfort factor with that. It's a terrible model for creating an informed populace, one that's familiar with debates about public issues that affect them. Doesn't give them any alternative perspectives to the ones they already bring to the table.
Zala, do you want to comment on that? On U.S. media using comedy, as my wife likes to watch Saturday Night Live, the Weekend Update because it makes fun of and does basically what the Comedy Central show, Daily Show, does. Do you see that as a typical American?
In a way, I do. I just want to make a point. I do come from the region that is very specific, which is former Yugoslavia, from Slovenia. And we were a part of a socialist bloc. So our media, in a way, was for 45 years state-owned, right? But what we are witnessing now is deregulation and privatization and terrible, terrible commercialization of the media. So what you witness back home as well is the rise of comedy shows, and people get the news or information from the comedy shows. Or even worse, David Letterman becomes kind of this popular icon where you kind of get the news from in Slovenia, right? Or in Hungary, or in Czech Republic. I mean, he is very, extremely popular. So it's Baywatch, Pamela Anderson, or David Letterman. So I think this creates kind of a particularly dangerous situation where you kind of import American commercial, or I would say better said, Western commercial media system in the region that does not have a particularly democratic public culture, media public culture, right? So what you have then is this terribly dangerous mixture of commercialism, consumption, right, in the media, within the media, and populist, common sense, nationalistic tendencies. So these two, yeah.
One of the things I heard at this conference, or went to one session, a man was talking about information society, how we've gone from an agrarian, agriculture-based society to an industrial age, and now we're in the information society age. And he said that the European Union and Canada and probably other places have in place what's called an information society policy, where they say, here's our policy, here's our guidelines for our politicians. We want our media or our information to look like this. It should be people-centered. It should have local content. It should have places to create and produce and exchange local content, like an access center. Is that something that you know of is in place?
Oh yeah, that is very true. I mean, Slovenia is joining, for example, European Union, and what that brings in, of course, is also the embracement of European Union's media laws. One of the things that I find very positive is this notion, it's a normative notion of public broadcasting, right? That cherishes the tradition of democracy and common access, and tries to represent really marginal voices within a specific society as well. So in Eastern Europe now, what we are seeing is also the employment of public broadcasting model and trying to reform, right, our broadcasting in this sense, to be more pluralistic, to be more democratic. And in this sense, we do have an encouragement of the political or economic elites to support this model. And this is, I think,
Okay, I just thought I'd chime in on this. One of the things that's, if we were to say, let's in the U.S. come up with an information society policy, you know, a series of rules that we think our media should adhere to in the name of the public interest. One of the things that you'll hear probably from large media corporations is the concern that they'll say, that violates our tradition of free speech. You know, it's a government imposition of policies upon upon our free media. And the really ironic thing is that if you look at the media coverage of the build-up to the war, our commercial media, supposedly independent, served much more as propaganda for the government than the publicly funded media in England, the BBC, served with respect to their government. They were very critical. Our media was not. So the notion that somehow government regulations are going to make the media less critical seems to be wrong, or let's say government support in any case.
One of the things I also heard at the conference more than once was how public radio and public television are kind of trying to quash other alternative or local media, like, for example, public television argues for rescinding cable access laws to disallow places like this, like PATV where we are now, because we're kind of competing for the same dollars, the same viewers, the same stuff. When if they were just funded and not had their funding cut all the time, and radio's included, radio was trying to get rid of the low power stations. Public radio, which is just right across the street from us, is saying we don't want to compete with these low power, these alternative media stations in our town, even though a lot of times ideologically I think they're on the same page or at least close. And that I think is something we need to address as far as media reform is quit cutting the funding of these public TV, public radio stations in the country. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, it's always a part of the conservative agenda to chop off funding for alternative media. The ideal there is to close the culture to any alternatives to a commercial, market-driven source of information. That's the goal. With respect to the kind of strategies that these companies pursue, take a look. I think is it this month's Harper's?
Right.
That's got an article about how Clear Channel was going around, and they don't have proof it was Clear Channel, but a local concert promoter was finding out that somebody was complaining about going in and looking up the permits for all the places where he brought in concerts, and the police were coming and shutting down his concerts based on these complaints. And this was in a Clear Channel market, and his assumption is that Clear Channel was doing the work to shut down the only competition that they had in town.
That's racketeering, kind of.
And again, it wasn't proven, but
right.
Yeah.
We have one more clip to play. A couple interviews from the conference. This is from the National Conference on Media Reform, which is in Madison, Wisconsin. Let's play that. They have a website, which is listed here at the front of this clip. Go ahead and play that. There it is. There's Al Franken, you see on the left there.
I heard about this event through an email list, and it just sounded like something that was so important, because the problems with our media to me seem to be really at the core of most of what's wrong. If we can affect change in the media, it'll help in many, many other directions too. Two threads that have most interested me here, I was only peripherally aware of before. One is working with the larger community, trying to bring groups together across ideological lines to develop ideas about what they'd like their media to be, and then taking those to their local media, particularly ones that are considered mainstream, mostly controlled by corporate interests, to see if they can negotiate at least some of the changes. Another thread that really interests me is media literacy, which I haven't been to a workshop on yet. So, but I think this is critical. I happen to work in two programs at the community college that actually work with high school and middle school students, preparing them to go on to college. So it really strikes a chord with me to find something to take back and possibly even use in one of those programs to help get the message out to students who probably understand this better than I do, actually. But to make sure that the young people are learning how to think critically, how to be able to sift through the huge amount of information that's available and identify what's good, what's valuable, and what should be disregarded.
There are a number of organizations that work in creating curriculum on media literacy. England and Canada has mandatory media literacy instruction in schools. Some 4,000 teachers are now involved in media literacy. The PTAs are interested in media literacy. There's a whole constituency out there of teachers and students who can engage in this issue. A lot of very concrete ideas. On our website, mediachannel.org, you will find a lot of resources if you want more information. In our mediachannel.org network and website, we try to make it look attractive. We try to make it easy to access. We try to offer timely news and information. I write 3,000 words every morning on a weblog about what's in the news that day, because I'm trying to connect. I try to also talk about not just what's wrong with mainstream media, but some people who are doing things that we can learn from and might have some impact. I cite stories, and this is another thing that I think we can do a better job at. There are people who still live in a world where there are other journalists and other voices that we need to hear from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They're accessible also. They want to reach out to us, and we have to find ways to reach out to them and include them in our work. We have to figure out ways to make our media sustainable, to find ways to generate revenue. The internet is free, quote unquote. Obviously, it's not free, but many people think it is. So we are trying to create a professional product at the time when many foundations are cutting back on their funding. What many of us don't realize, for example, is that the so-called liberal foundations in America actually have more money than the right-wing foundations. The right-wing foundations put media 1 and 2 on their list. The liberal left-wing foundations, it's not even on the list. Why? Partly because we don't talk. And I don't have the answers to all of these questions. Obviously, this is a collective search for answers. But I do have some questions, and I know that we have to be willing to be as critical of our own work and each other's work as we are of the mainstream media's work, because then, only then will it get better than it is today.
Okay, welcome back to Iowa City Other News. I'm going to go right to Zala Volcic because you mentioned you've done some media literacy work in your classrooms. What do you do? How do you?
Yeah, I did some media literacy projects, media education projects back home, and I also try to discuss these topics within the classrooms in Boulder. In Slovenia is a very small nation, 2 million population, and what we tried to do, and we succeeded, was we developed and created a course called Media Education, which is now implemented in all primary schools and secondary schools nationwide. So every Slovene kid basically is exposed to some of critical thinking about the media. So topics such as, violence, advertising, consumption, stereotypes in the media representations. These are all the questions that are addressed in the classrooms. And it's so important, right, the education about the media, so that the kids start to pose questions, right, what the media do to us in a very kind of critical way. And it became one of the most popular courses.
Right.
The kids love it. They love to question. I mean, they live with the media.
Yeah, cool. One of the things I've taught here at PATV is that media literacy, how can you be literate if all you're doing is receiving information?
Right.
You have to be able to create it, or at least write a story, or
Right.
give a verbal or oral description of something, or news story, or
Right.
something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the response really is that you don't become cynical or savvy or kind of just smart, right, about the media, but that you also get involved, right? So that you are aware of both sides, of the side of the production and the side of the consumption, and that you get involved again, right, engaged with the reality, with the media world, and that you challenge, right, the common sense again that is out there. And it's so important for the students in Boulder as well, right? I mean, they're very disillusioned in a way about their future careers as journalists, right? It's like, oh, what is in front of me? Mainstream, right? That's all. And I keep telling them it's not true. It's up to you, right?
Mark, you mentioned that you worked in print journalism. You worked for Gannett Corporation. Was there something while you were there that turned you and said, I need to get out of this corporate media and into a more critical stance?
Yeah, very much. This is, it's what drove me to go back to school to study the media and try to figure out possible alternatives to what we've got. I was working for small and mid-sized newspapers, and Gannett uses those small and mid-sized newspapers as basically revenue generators for its larger projects. So USA Today, their main project, which was losing money for a long time, I think it's actually making money now, was the Detroit News was another one of their big papers, one of their flagship papers, was losing money, but they could support it because they were making money at these small newspapers, like where I was working, and the way they did that was by cutting reporting staff year after year after year, and raising advertising revenues and reporting an increasing rate of return. And the pressure on the publisher was huge. He didn't have to just come up with a good rate of return every year. He had to improve his rate of return every year. This meant attrition in the newsroom. What attrition in the newsroom? The newsroom was something like 15 or 20% smaller when I was working there than it had been in the 70s. what's happening is, yeah, you have a local newspaper, but it's becoming basically an advertising supplement with the stories that we had to write we had to turn out lots of stories, very short, very, not in depth very much at all. I got occasional opportunities to do in-depth reporting, but they were few and far between. To get to do the kind of story you do once a year is disappointing for a career that you get involved with, because you think you'll be doing those kinds of stories every day. So you do lots of feature stories, lots of very quick hit press release stories, and that fills the gap between the ads. And after a while, you feel like you're working for an advertising supplement that does very little to
or a
inform
factory
the
line kind of assembly.
Yeah, I was thinking, in a very few years, they'll come up with a machine that can generate these stories. They'll just put in the information about the accident or the city council meeting, and it'll just come out with these stories.
One of the things at the conference that I heard about was creating a media map as a way for people to start to think about, okay, my radio station is here, they broadcast this far, there's a TV station here, they reach this part, where do I sit in the middle of all this? I get 2 newspapers or 3 newspapers, or I have access to those newspapers. But to start to think about where you are in context, your local media, where is it coming from? And then to go, okay, this radio station reaches me on these days or not. Who owns that station? Do they own anything else? Example, in this area, the Gazette and KCRG owned by the same company. And is that too much of a concentration? What do you think about local media, just quickly, in this area? Do we have enough? Do we not have enough? What do you listen to, or where do you go?
I tend, because I just moved here, I tend to listen to national media of one kind or another. We seem to have a fair number of outlets, and this is one of the things that I experience in a number of places that I lived. A fair number of outlets, but without a really satisfying coverage of local content and local issues.
Zala, what's it like in Boulder?
Boulder, I think Boulder is very diverse. It really is. Great student radio station, free speech television, local NPR, community radio, KJB, with David Barsamian, and then Noam Chomsky visiting town. So in that aspect, I mean, it's very diverse on actually both political spectrums, I would say. So it's good.
We're going to go now to our soapbox. We call it Where's the Outrage? This is a chance for people in the community to come on the show and be outraged and ask questions. So today we have Luther, and he's talking about the decline of Iowa City. Let's go to this next segment, Where's the Outrage?
Thank you, Adam. I'm here to talk about something that I see going on in Iowa City. I think it needs to be made clear to everyone that Iowa City is not Chicago. But in a way, I see Iowa City sliding towards some of these problems of the big cities. The first part I'd like to talk about is the downtown vacancies that we have. We have this giant mall squatting in the middle of our downtown area that is generating no money, has nothing but empty storefronts, and is a waste of space. But what are we doing with that? We're now deciding to build another building downtown in this Plaza Towers. To what end is all this for? They're empty buildings. We're not encouraging businesses to come here, and not even retail businesses. We're talking companies like Geico or MCI or any of these large phone operating companies. We don't offer them incentives to come move their business downtown. Instead, they move them out to these new buildings in Coralville or in North Liberty or on the south side of Iowa City or on the west side of Iowa City. And to me, it doesn't really make any sense. We're not a big town. There's no reason for these things to be going on, yet they're happening. My second point is the slums in Iowa City. There's no reason for Iowa City to have slums, but we have slums. We have the student ghetto, Johnson, Van Buren, Dodge, up into the back side of downtown, up even to the north side of downtown. And these are woefully inadequate housing facilities, or 3-bedroom apartments for $900 that are just crap. They're no more than stacked trailers, but we charge these students the incredible amounts of money for them. The city doesn't put any effort into making them, livable. There's one that's been built on a toxic waste dump, And there's nothing being done about this. This has been going on as long as I've been here, and I'm sure it's been going on before that. To me, in a town this small, in a town that doesn't have, you know, a shifting industrial base. It's not like the old Dodge plant closed down and then all the jobs left. The University of Iowa has been here is pretty much as long as the city has been here, and that hasn't gone anywhere. But we get this slow happening of the decline of the central part of town, the escape of people to the outside of town, and then the heart of the city gets run down. And I think that the only thing that's really saving that from being even worse and being more like the larger towns is the University of Iowa. But then again, you know, the city likes to discourage the University of Iowa. You know, there's this constant battle between them, but that's another subject for another time. And it's not just in downtown. The Pepperwood Plaza out on Highway 6 is after they built the mall and Best Buy left and you know, the Econo Foods closed down. In the last year, there's probably been 15 different shops that have tried to open up there, and they can't stay open. I don't know if it's because of the atrocious parking lot, the neighborhood, there's no effort to keep these businesses there. I don't understand why this is happening in a town this small. The worst part of it all is that it's a little mirror of the white flight of the large urban landscapes of the 50s and 60s. You know, they're building these inflatable houses out on Rurit and out, you know, on the east end of town, and you know, everybody who had a house downtown then moves out there and they bring their kids with them. And the worst part about that to me is that when they do this, they bring their families and their homes and they move away, and then they build a new elementary school, and then their kids get to go to that elementary school, but the kids who still lived, you know, downtown in the south side of town and the north side of town have to go to these underfunded, you know, elementary schools that are falling apart. And I guess I'm kind of running short on all the things that I'd like to talk about. I kind of get riled up about subjects. But I just would like to say that Iowa City is a small town, and there's really no reason for things like this to be happening in a town this small. It's I don't know if it's the city council. I don't know if it's the efforts of the landed aristocracy in this city. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Thank you.
Okay, that was Luther Nash with Where's the Outrage? This is a regular segment on our show, a chance for people to editorialize a little bit. I'm going to make some announcements. Saturday and Sunday in Columbus, Georgia, there is protest of the former School of the Americas, also known as the School of the Assassins. Actually, they made such a great name for themselves, they decided to change it. Whitewashed, it's now the Western Hemisphere Institute for something something. That is going on all weekend, November 22nd and 23rd. So if you have a chance to go there and let those people know, we want to close that place down. What else did I wanted to mention that Iowa City Other News was honored to receive an award from PATV as the first and only. They're the first collective group to run a show at PATV, and the only local news show in Iowa City, which is something I like to brag about, that we're the only news program regularly produced in Iowa City. There is no other broadcast or cablecast news show from Iowa City. If you want to get the closest broadcast news is in Cedar Rapids. There's a station in West Branch, etc. With me in the studio, we just have a few minutes left, Zala Volcic, Mark Andreevich, and what are some final words on media reform or media issues you want to talk about? I think we have 5 minutes, so let's say 2 or 3 minutes apiece, and we'll just keep talking until the show runs out, basically.
Okay, well, one of my main harangues about the media is we're told so often by the large corporations that dominate the media, that all they're doing is serving their markets, that in some sense they're very democratic because they're driven by ratings. One of the points that I try to drive home to my students is media outlets actually serve several audiences, of which viewers are only one. The other audience, of course, is advertisers. Those are their main clients, which means that the type of content that the commercial media produce is geared to please advertisers, to encourage advertisers to advertise on those shows. And one way to do that is, of course, is ratings. But the other way is you don't want to create a media product that doesn't create a favorable environment for advertising. And that narrows down and shapes the kind of content that's produced. You've got to come up with shows that are favorable for advertising. Don't force people to think too much, don't challenge their ideas, aren't controversial. And the other audience that we don't think about very much, or increasingly important audience these days, are government regulators. Media outlets have to make sure that if they want to be giants and become even larger giants, they don't offend the government. And so recently, the example of CBS pulling the Reagan show, interesting. They claimed it was public outrage. Well, perhaps in part. It was also, they're very cognizant that they have a big stake in this upcoming FCC regulations. CBS, Viacom, which owns CBS, would like to be able to grow its audience from 35% to 45% of the population, as these regulations would allow. This is a pending piece of legislation, and you don't want to offend the government at the time when you're asking them to do you the favor of let you get bigger.
So how free can their speech really be if they're self-censoring themselves against the government?
Yeah, they're already over the 35% cap, by the way, so they have a big stake in getting these regulations passed. Yeah.
I think we have to roll credits, but as we do that, if we would, I want to say that if you email us, ic_othernews@yahoo.com, we will send you a list of some of the websites that I got from the media conference, mediachannel.org, and some of our other favorite alternative media reform, and alternative media source websites. That I think we'll play that email address here. There it is, the contact info for Iowa City Other News. So if you want a list of websites, we can email those to you. Thank you to Zala Volcic.
Thank you.
Mark Andreevich.
Thank you. Good job.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the award.
Well, yeah.
Other News. Coming up next today is Access Update, and I have another piece about this conference on that show. Is it today? Well, later today on Access Update, I have about a 10-minute piece about this media conference. Talks about some of the same issues and some more specific to cable access issues. Let's roll the credits and see that closing footage. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And thanks Luther Nash also for being on the show.
Watch the dozens arresting, no tears. Sympathizers surrounded with Jews. Flock to ovens are building up fears. Watch them all from the heart. When they go and time has been long, and then they know they'll always be wrong. Weak ones, tall ones, ones that are strong. Take them out when they start. Pondering the travesties from making all a name. Reaping wooden majesties, they see it just a game.